Good morning. Hey, welcome again to Grace City Church. It's great to be with you guys. Happy Sunday. It's a good morning to be in church. My name's James. I'm part of the team here at Grace City, and it's my huge privilege to get to carry on our series that Mike kicked us off with last week, looking at some of the heroes of the Christian faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's a series that we're looking at God's unchanging purpose to his people, to be a people to bless the nations. As Anne so eloquently said just then, Anne, it was like you listened to the message from last Sunday. That's who we are. We're the continuation of that promise, the continuation of that call to be a people to bless the nations. And so I'm just going to get straight into it here today. And I want to let you know what the big idea for this morning's message is straight off the bat. That way, if you've got to get to lunch or something like that, catch a bus, you can exit when you need to. The big idea for this morning's message, nobody moved just yet, because I haven't said what that is yet. The big idea for this morning's message is that God's work will not be achieved by human effort. God's work will not be achieved by human manipulation or human shortcuts. But before we get into that, and to kind of frame the message, I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of what's happened in the known world up until the point that we're going to be looking at this story here today. And we're going to get that brief rundown from the book of Genesis, which is the book that we're looking at throughout this series. So the book of Genesis is a Hebrew word which means beginnings. It's the first book in the Bible, and it's broken up into two main chunks. You've got chapters 1 to 11, which look at God creating the world in perfection in the Garden of Eden. But then, as sin enters the world, humanity begins this kind of spiral of self-destruction and chapter 11 finishes with the Tower of Babel, with humanity deciding that they thought they could be equal to God, to build a tower to try to reach him, and then God scatters the rebellious humanity across the world and confuses their language. Then we get to chapter 12, which is where we kicked off last week. And what links these two sections of Genesis really is the story of Abraham and God's promise to him. Chapter 12 to 50 is really about one family. God focuses in on one family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. And God initiates a rescue plan to take humanity, rebellious humanity, back to the perfection of the garden, back to where he always intended them to be. And Abraham and his family, they're sometimes held up as kind of heroes of the Christian faith. And it would be easy to look at today's story and the stories you're going to hear over the next few weeks and say, well, they're stories about how to be a good person. But actually, as we heard last week and as we're going to hear a little bit more about, for the most part, this family of God's is pretty dysfunctional, actually. God's choice is surprising, but it's also perfect, God's choice in Abraham. He doesn't look for an impressive founder to his new family. He chooses a complete nobody, actually. He chooses nobody because nobody finds it easier than somebody's to admit that God is God and that they are not. Because God's plans will not be achieved through human effort. They won't be achieved through human manipulation. Now, this is particularly important for you if you're here today and you're not sure whether you'd call yourself a Christian, or maybe you're sure that you wouldn't call yourself a Christian. Don't be put off by the failings of many Christians. If you are, you've missed the point. Christians are people who know that they're a mess. We know we're a mess and we're in need of a Savior. We know we're nobodies when we're following after a great somebody. And in a similar way, don't go to the opposite extreme and assume that you can't turn to God because your life isn't virtuous enough. It's not as virtuous as the lives of some of those Christian friends that you might have around you. That misses the point too, because God chooses ordinary people. He chooses nobodies who are following after a great somebody. And he chooses people who are ordinary, and he takes responsibility for turning them into the people that he always planned for them to be. And Abraham is that sort of guy. He's an ordinary guy. In fact, you know what? Abraham is an idolater. It says in Joshua 24, long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Abraham was an idolater. He worshipped the creation rather than God, his creator. In fact, he was so immersed in the culture of Babel where he came out of that he married his sister. Who here can relate to that today? No hands. Good. That was just a test. And then he figures that it's okay for him also to have sex with his slave girls. We're going to read in the passage that we're going to get to in a moment. Abraham's an unlikely choice. He's an ordinary guy. In many ways, he's a mess. And maybe you can relate to him, not the sister bit, but maybe you can relate to him in some other ways as well. Yet the Lord chooses him to be the founder of the family of God. Now let me show you a little bit further why he's also an unlikely choice. Now we need to understand a little bit about ancient culture in order to see this, but because I'm a 21st century Australian, I love both of my daughters equally. And even if I was to have more children, and if I was to have a son, I would still love all of my children equally. But in ancient cultures, that wasn't the case. In ancient cultures, it was all about the firstborn son. All the other kids were just also-rans. Do you know that Abraham wasn't even the firstborn son? He was born 60 years after his eldest brother. Abraham was an afterthought. Abraham was an ordinary guy. Abraham was a nobody. And to make things even worse, Abraham and his wife Sarah couldn't even have kids. If there was anything that God was looking for in the founder of a new family, you would have expected the ability to be able to have children to be one of the main things he was looking for. But at 75 years old, the word of the Lord comes to the childless Abraham. And in Hebrews 11, it puts this like this: Abraham at this point was as good as dead. God isn't looking for followers who are brilliant. He's looking for people who admit that they're nobodies but are following after the great somebody. He's looking for people who are willing to gamble everything on the fact that he is God and that they are not. But having said all that, what Abraham lacks in credentials, he makes up for in faith. As we heard from Mike last week, having been called by God to go, he throws away his idols and he leaves a place of familiarity and comfort, and he becomes a nomad in the desert, and in the end ends up pitching his tent amongst the hostile inhabitants of Canaan. He's a man of faith. He responds to God's call to go. And when God asked him to change his name from Abram to Abraham, he wasn't just asking him to put 2 more letters into his name. Abraham, the name, means the father of many. That's what the name means. So God was asking the infertile old man to declare that he trusted God in spite of the laughter of his neighbors and in spite of all the evidence around him to the contrary. He was an ordinary man, but he was a man of faith. He was a surprising choice, but in many ways, the perfect choice for God. Genesis 15:6 says, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He gambled everything on the faithfulness of God, and the Bible says that he reaped the reward for that gamble, but not without reminding us about some of his lack of credentials along the way, which is what we're going to look at this morning. Because in order for God to fulfill the big promise to Abraham, that he would be the father of many nations, God had to fulfill the smaller promise to him that he would have a son, that he would have an heir, right? But here's the ironic thing. What was true for Abraham is often true for us, is that sometimes it's easier to trust God in the big things than it is to trust him in the small things. Sometimes it's easier to trust God with the future than it is to trust him with the here and now. Why is that? Why is it that as Christians, we've trusted God with our eternity, the big future thing, but still it's sometimes hard to trust him for our daily bread? Why is that? This passage that we're going to look at speaks to me personally for a number of reasons. Partly because, as I've confessed from this spot on numerous occasions over the last few years, I struggle with patience. I struggle to wait on God for God to do things in his timing. But I get to preach on that again today, which is great. Also because actually I felt through my scripture reading last year that God highlighted a number of men in the Bible to me that went through long periods of waiting. I felt God was on my case about it again last year as I was reading scripture. Here are a few that I read about. I read about Abraham. I read that there were 25 years that passed, as we're going to hear, between receiving the promise to be the father of many nations and having his heir Isaac. 25 years. Moses wandered the desert for 40 years. Jacob, as you'll hear about later in the series, there was some 20 years that passed between him receiving his brother's birthright and then God touching his hip, changing his name, and him going on to be fruitful in ministry. Paul himself had 8 years between becoming a Christian and going out on his first missionary trip. These were men who waited a long time for God to do what he had planned and what he had promised with them. In fact, it seems that anybody who's going to be used of God in any way goes through a long period of waiting and cultivating and shaping and softening as well. And so in God's sovereign wisdom, I get to preach on that again to you this morning. So let's see how Abraham and Sarah handle this long period of waiting. We're going to be in the book of Genesis in chapter 16. So if you've got Bibles with you, I'd encourage you to turn to them or turn on your devices. It's going to come up on the screen behind me, but there's something about thumbing your way through Scripture that's good as well. You can write things in the margin as God speaks it to you. So if you've got a Bible, if you could open it up, follow with me from Genesis 16. Also, I just want to say by way of introduction to this passage that God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah in the next chapter. So you're going to hear those names used interchangeably throughout this series. Don't be confused by that. They are the same person. We're just going to walk through this passage today and pull out some things I felt God say to me as I was looking at it. Genesis 16:1 says this: Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." You know, she blames God for that. "God, go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Perhaps I can build a family through her. You know, there seems to be three ways that people tend to reject the promises of God or tend to despise the promises of God. First of all, they reject it or they ignore it completely. Maybe God calls them to something and they say, "God, that's not convenient for my life at this point in time. God, I don't like that thing that you're calling me to. God, the cost is too great. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to reject it completely." That tends to be one way that people despise the promises of God. Here are another couple of ways. Maybe they receive the promise initially, what God's called them to, but it doesn't happen for a while, so they decide they're going to try to make it happen. They try to make God's promises come to pass. That's what we're going to read in this story here today. And there's a third way I think that people can despise the promises of God. Having believed God for a season, they decide, you know what, too much time's passed. I'm just going to leave it. I'm just going to ignore it. It's obviously been too long and I've lost faith, and they just dismiss it altogether. You know, this also tends to be the way that people despise God's call to salvation and despise God's promise of new life in Him. You know, see, we all are born into a world of struggle and a world of misery, and we live lives as rebels against a holy God, and that's a really big deal. But in His mercy and in His grace, God says to us, "Hey, humanity, I want you to turn back to me. I want you to turn back to me. Turn away from your sin. Let me be friends with you again. I want to prepare a place for you where everything is good and nothing is bad." God in His grace has that offer of friendship that He extends to us, but people tend to reject that in one of these three ways. Perhaps they say, "Well, I have to admit that I'm a sinner. I'm a pretty decent bloke. Like, compared to others, I'm a reasonable guy. I don't feel like I need to admit that I'm really that sinful," and they ignore it altogether. Or they think, "I've got to surrender control of my life, but I've worked so hard to get where I am. I don't want to give up my life now. I don't want to have to surrender everything and control of everything to Him." Or they say, "Well, I kind of believed for a bit, it felt good for a little while, but then I realized that a lifetime is a long time. And then I realized that He wanted me to put Him first in everything. You know what? It's too big a cost. It's too big a cost. It's too much to ask. I think I'm just going to leave it." But God calls us to perseverance. God calls us to be faithful and calls us to be steadfast. Now, Abraham had received the promise that he would be the father of many nations. He and his wife had waited for a while and it hadn't happened. So they decided they were going to try to make it happen. "Take Hagar," Sarai said. "Take Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." It hadn't happened. So they decided they were going to try to make it happen. I've got to admit, that's me all over. I don't know if that's you as well, but that's how I can be. But God's work will not be achieved through human effort. God's work will not be achieved through human manipulation. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think is best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Go sleep with Hagar, Abram. He was passive in his faith, but very much active in his sin. And it's here that we see the destructiveness of sin. Sin's a really big deal. Sin's not just doing bad stuff. It's rebellion against a holy God, and God hates it. He really, really hates it. It's rubbing the gifts that God has given us back in his face, and he hates it. He hates it because it's destructive for us, because it does us harm as the people that he loves. We see the destructiveness of sin in that there's relationship breakdown here in this story. We see that there's a loss of trust, there's accusation, there's anger, there's blame throwing, there's oppression, there's bullying, there's mistreatment. We see that there's also conflict. That's part of the destructiveness of sin. Do you know that the Quran recognizes Ishmael, which is the son that's going to be born to the slave girl Hagar, recognizes Ishmael as one of the prophets of Islam, as one of the forefathers of Muhammad, and one of the patriarchs of the religion. All right, that means that one moment of pleasure has led to 4,000 years of bloodshed. There is conflict that is created through sin. Not only that, but there's also abuse and neglect. Sarai mistreated Hagar, and so she fled from her. Hagar's used and abused, she's neglected, and she's rejected. I don't know if you picked up through these first few verses, but every time that Hagar gets mentioned by Abram or Sarai, they call her that slave girl, or my slave, or something like that. Verse 2, the slave. Verse 5, the slave. Verse 6, the slave. She's just an instrument. She's just used. You know, it's so much easier when you depersonalize the people that you abuse. So can you relate to that? Perhaps you are here today and you feel like you're a Hagar. You feel like you've been abused, you've been neglected, and you've been rejected. Or maybe you're here and you feel like, actually, I've done the opposite. I've been the abuser. I've done the neglecting. I've done the rejecting. Maybe it's something as simple as God has been calling you to go and reach out to a neighbor or a work colleague or something like that. But you feel like nobody else really likes this person. They're always negative and complaining. I don't want to be associated with them. That will damage my reputation. So even though God's calling me to go speak to them, I feel like I can't. And you neglect and reject that person. Perhaps you feel like you can be on that side of the coin as well. And how many Hagars are there walking around in our city? People whose lives are a mess, who are miserable, who are lonely, who have been abused and neglected and left alone. But there's hope. There's always hope in God, because there's an encounter with God that is about to come. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. Verse 8, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? He asked her two questions. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And the angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. You know, a lot of commentators say that when the Old Testament talks about an angel of the Lord, it's often a pre-incarnate Old Testament appearance of Jesus, actually, that Jesus is the one who appears to Hagar at this time. Jesus appears to her in her moment of need. And do you notice he asks her two questions? He says, hey, where have you come from and where are you going? Do you notice she only gives the answer to one question, where she's come from? You know why? Because I don't think she knows the answer to the second question. She doesn't know where she's going. How many Hagars are there in our city who do not know where they're going? Perhaps you're here this morning and you don't know where you're going either. If this text doesn't meet you in your brokenness, it's meant to spur you on to have compassion for the Hagars that are in our city, that are in our suburb, that are in our nation. Because our God is a God who meets broken people in their time of need. And because as Christians, we know that there was a time in our life where God met us in our misery, God met us in our loneliness. And it's because of that, because we realize the depth of our need for mercy, that we're able to have mercy on other people. God hears Hagar. God meets Hagar. God speaks to her. Verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. I think that's a beautiful line. I have now seen the one who sees me. Verse 15, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And God restores Hagar back to Abram, and her son is raised within the safety and the protection of a family. And in a sense, it's kind of a little bit of closure on the story, but there's still a mess. And the good news is it's not the end of the story. Abram, I think, he thought it was the end. In the next chapter, in Genesis 17, Abram said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. I think Abraham thought that was the end. I think he thought that Ishmael was going to be the son that fulfilled God's promise. I think that he thought, well, God promised a child to Sarah and I, but maybe this was the best that we could get. Maybe because of our sinfulness and our disobedience and our weakness, maybe we kind of got a watered down version of God's promise. But I don't think God's in the business of watering down his promises to us. You know, divine mercy brings good out of human folly. And the message that keeps coming to this family, as we'll read later in Genesis, time and time again, and keeps coming to us as the extension of God's people, is that though others meant it for evil, God is working it for good. The result of this sinful manipulation was 13 years of silence between God and Abraham. 13 years of silence. But then here in Genesis 17, in their old age, God speaks again. Verse 19, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. God speaks a second time. God speaks again. This is one of the most encouraging things that you'll read in Scripture, and you'll read it in Scripture time and time again, that God is a God of another chance because he's a God of phenomenal grace. See, the story isn't really about Abraham at all. It's about God and how God deals with his servants. See, God takes what seems to be spoiled goods and he speaks to them again and he reinstates them again. And the Bible is full of people who blew it, and then God comes again on the scene because he's a God of phenomenal grace. And that is good news for you, and that is great news for me. Think about Jonah, who we heard about just a few months ago. God said, hey, go to Nineveh. And Jonah goes 2,500 kilometers in the opposite direction. And he ends up in a storm. And he ends up being hurled overboard and swallowed by a huge fish and then regurgitated by that fish. And what happens next? The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. He's a God of tremendous grace. Think about Peter. He said to Jesus, Jesus, I'll never let you down. I'll never deny you. And then that night, 3 times, he denied Jesus. What happens next? The resurrected Jesus appears to Peter again, makes him breakfast, and reinstates him. And it comes around the time of Pentecost, and you'd sort of expect Peter to be standing at the back of the crowd because he's got to earn his stripes back. He's got to kind of win cred back with Jesus again. But where is he? No, he's reinstated again to the main spokesman. Why? Because God's a God of grace. He's a God of tremendous grace. And the New Testament is littered with numerous examples about of people like this. Grace means that you don't get what you deserve. And none of these men and you and I, we don't deserve another chance, but God gives it anyway because he's the God of grace. Do you feel like you've run away from God's call? God's grace means there's another chance for you. Do you feel like you're only left with the leftovers of God's promise because of your disobedience? God's grace says there's another chance for you. Do you feel like God's washed his hands of you because you've been rebelling against him? God's grace says there's another chance for you. He's a wonderful God of grace. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and he responded in faith. He responded in faith. He left a place of comfort and familiarity, and he set out as a nomad to an unfamiliar land. He and Sarah, they were trusting God with the big and the future things, but they struggled to trust him with the small now needs that they had as well. They didn't have a son. They didn't have an heir. God's work will not be achieved by human effort. It just won't be achieved by human manipulation. In spite of all of this mess, God speaks again. He says, hey, you and Sarah, you'll have a son and you'll call him Isaac. That's phenomenal grace. That's unmerited favor. That God is a God of not just a second chance, he's the God of another chance. He comes to us time and time again. And here in chapter 21, we see that. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. I love that Isaac was perfectly on time. 25 years of waiting, but perfectly on time. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. I've been reading the Jesus Storybook Bible to my girls in the morning sometimes. It's actually where I get most of my theology from. And I just love, we read this story a couple of weeks ago, and I just love how, is Sally Lloyd-Jones any relation to the great Martin Lloyd-Jones? And I just love how she captures this. She says at the end of this story, sure enough, 9 months later, just as God had promised, Sarah gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Isaac, which means son of laughter, and Sarah laughed. But this time it was a glorious, happy laugh. Her dream had come true. God would do as he promised. He would always look after Abram's family, his special people. And one day, God would send another baby, a baby promised to a girl who didn't even have a husband. But this baby would bring laughter to the whole world. This baby would be everyone's dream come true. God's work will not be achieved by human effort. God's work will not be achieved by human manipulation, not your salvation and not his mission. So how are you responding to the call? How are you responding to his promises? If you're here today and you're not sure whether you're a Christian or you're sure you're not a Christian, God's call to you is this: hey, please turn back to me. Please turn back to me. I love you and I want to be friends with you again. Please return to me. Please turn from your sins. Please, I want to be friends. I want to take you to a place where everything is good and nothing is bad and there's no sin or pain or sickness or torment or tears any longer. That's God's call to you. How are you responding to his call? God's purpose is unchanging, and so is his call to be his people, to be blessed, to be a blessing to your workplaces, to be a blessing to your neighborhood, to be a blessing to your class, to be a blessing to the city, to be a blessing to the nation and the nations. And God's in the habit of birthing the impossible within his people. What's he birthing within you? Now, before we started this morning, Julian came up to me and he said he felt as we were praying to share Romans 4:17 with me, which says that God calls out the things that are not as though they were. God calls out the things that are not as though they were. He's birthing the impossible within us as a people. What is he birthing within you? He's called us to shape a city. How are you responding? He's called us to be a house for the nations as a church. How are you responding to that call? He's called us to be a city-shaping church. He's called us to serve the poor. He's called us to be a healing center. How are you responding to his call on us as a church, as a people? Because that's a call collectively for all of us here. And what's he birthing within you? Maybe he's calling you to start a business. Maybe he's calling you to start a business that doesn't just create wealth, but it helps employ people who are disadvantaged or refugees in our area or something like that. Maybe he's calling you to join the local P&C to be a salt and light in that place. Maybe he's calling you to pray with a colleague at work that you've heard is a Christian. Maybe he's calling you to share the gospel with your neighbor that you've had numerous conversations with, and now's the time to let them know where you're at from a faith perspective. Perhaps he's calling you to relocate at some point, to be a part of an upcoming church plant. Or perhaps he's calling you to set aside the dream of owning where you want to live, but rather living where he's called you to own. How are you responding to his call to you? Maybe if the band can come, I'm just going to finish with this. Just after the famous Hall of Faith passage in Hebrews 11 comes Hebrews 12, no surprises there. And Hebrews 11 features Abraham as one of the heroes of the Christian faith. But Hebrews 12 says this: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses," that's all those heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, "let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and so you will not lose heart." The reality is that there's really only one hero in this story. There's really only one great somebody who's going to bring laughter to the whole world and who will be everybody's dream come true. And that person is Jesus. And how will you respond? How will you respond to the call and the promises that are on your life as an individual and on our calling as a church collectively? Keeping your eyes fixed on him, respond in faith. Keeping your eyes fixed on him, believe in faith. Keeping your eyes fixed on him, rest in faith. Keeping your eyes fixed on him, trust in faith. Keeping your eyes fixed on him, act by faith. How are we to respond to God's call on us? Keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, who started it all and will finish it all in his perfect timing. When you stand with me, we're going to celebrate this faithful God together.